again, not true. One version of Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095 urging French warriors to embark on what would become known as the First Crusade does note that they might make spoil of the enemy's treasures. But this was no more than an observation on the usual way of financing war in ancient and medieval society. And Fulcher of Chartres did write in the early 12th century that those who had been poor in the West had become rich in the East, as a result of their efforts on the First Crusade, obviously suggesting that others might do likewise. But Fulcher's statement has to be read in its context, which was a chronic and eventually fatal shortage of manpower for the defense of the Crusader states. Fulcher was not being entirely deceitful when he pointed out that one might become rich as a result of crusading. But he was not being entirely straightforward either, because for most participants, crusading was ruinously expensive. As Fred Kazel has noted, few crusaders had sufficient cash, both to pay their obligations at home, and to support themselves decently on a crusade. From the very beginning, financial considerations played a major role in crusade planning. The early crusaders sold off so many of their possessions, to finance their expeditions, that they caused widespread inflation. Although later crusaders took this into account, and began saving money long before they set out, the expense was still nearly prohibitive. Despite the fact that money did not yet play a major role in Western European economies in the 11th century, there was a heavy and persistent flow of money from west to east as a result of the Crusades, and the financial demands of crusading caused profound economic and monetary changes in both Western Europe and the Levant. One of the chief reasons for the founding of the Fourth Crusade, and its diversion to Constantinople, was the fact that it ran out of money before it had gotten properly started, and was so indebted to the Venetians that it found itself unable to keep control of its own destiny. Louis IX's Seventh Crusade in the mid-13th century cost more than 6 times the annual revenue of the crown. The popes resorted to ever more desperate ploys to raise money to finance crusades, from instituting the first income tax in the early 13th century, to making a series of adjustments in the way that indulgences were handled that eventually led to the abuses condemned by Martin Luther. Even by the 13th century, most crusade planners assumed that it would be impossible to attract enough volunteers to make a crusade possible, and crusading became the province of kings and popes, losing its original popular character. When the Hospitaller Master Fulk of Villeret wrote a crusade memo to Pope Clement V in about 1305, he noted that it would be a good idea if the Lord Pope took steps enabling him to assemble a great treasure, without which such a passage crusade would be impossible. A few years later, Marino Sanudo estimated that it would cost 5 million florins over 2 years to effect the conquest of Egypt. Although he did not say so, and may not have realized it, the sums necessary simply made the goal impossible to achieve. By this time, most responsible officials in the West had come to the same conclusion, which explains why fewer and fewer crusades were launched from the 14th century on. In short, very few people became rich by crusading, and their numbers were dwarfed by those who were bankrupted. Most medieval people were quite well aware of this, and did not consider crusading a way to improve their financial situations.